just as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of this country and their connection to land, water and community, and to acknowledge that it is, always was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and pay respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues in the room with us today. So I'm just going to start this conversation with, this message that we talk about all the time, and the start point of this is that all behaviour is a message, yeah? So when we're talking about how we respond to young people's behaviours, we have to always try and think of what is the underlying message that young people are sending us through their behaviour. And the messages can be things like, I feel overwhelmed, I'm finding the work difficult, I don't want to be shamed in front of my peers, I feel anxious. Yeah. When children display behaviours of concern, they may not yet have the social emotional skills, or they might not yet have the awareness or the regulation skills to always be able to override those sorts of messages, yeah, in that situation or in that moment, and conform to the social standard that's asked of them at school. Yeah, so I think sometimes, whoops, the PowerPoint's going ahead of me. See, it's telling me I need to move on or I'm going to talk too much. But I do just want to say that I think sometimes where things get a little bit confused in school situations is that sometimes young people will be able to display the behaviours that schools are looking for, and at other times they won't, yeah? And there are some factors, maybe it's a contextual factor that's in the actual environment, maybe it's something that happened, the morning before or the night before. That's shifting that dynamic, and really they're the sorts of things that we really want to help schools be attuned to when we're advocating for them. But essentially, problem solving with the child is really helping us to understand the message and to find solutions that the young person is actually going to buy into. If they're part of working out the solution, you're much more likely to get their buy-in. The other concept that I think is so important is that we really need to practice, the strategies with training wheels. And this comes from Megan, help me out, Dr. Billy, who talks about school refusal in some really great webinars, who talks about how we often ask children to use their strategies in the most difficult environment, that is in school, when they are most highly distressed, right? Whereas what kids need is a lot of opportunity to practice the strategies in the easiest environment with the most support. So they're going to need to practice at homes, they're going to need to practice with trusted adults when calm at school, and we need to gradually build up the skills. So when we see strategies outlined in education support plans, we really need to talk about how are those strategies being practiced? Can they actually be realistically expected to follow those strategies in a heightened situation in the most complex environment of school? Yeah, which is where I think things often fall down. We just have these expectations that actually a young person can't meet in that particular situation at that particular moment. So we're almost setting them up to fail at times, yeah. So if we look at problem solving in schools, most schools will have some form of problem solving activity built into their behaviour procedures. So when we're talking with schools, we can ask, like, what problem solving approaches do you use? And then what do we think is the extra scaffolding or support or practice our child might need to be able to use these strategies realistically and well? We really need to make sure that everyone is on the same page in understanding that the repetition and practice that the kids might need to understand, really importantly to trust these processes and then to be able to use them, yeah? Because if we ask a young person to use a strategy and perhaps the relief teacher's not familiar with that strategy and they don't follow it through, then a young person will really quickly lose trust, yeah, in the processes that have been agreed to. And we really want to check that this is reflected in education plans. And that might be generally reflected in education plans. It might not have all the depth of exactly what's going to happen. That might be followed up in behavioural plans or in classroom adjustments, but that it is reflected in an education plan that we are going to use problem-solving strategies in response to a behaviour of concern or in response to escalated situations. That's going to be our first point of call. Yeah. When we talk about using a problem-solving response in the school's response to behaviour, for example, instead of a teacher being cross or, instead of a suspension or an under-enrolment or being sent home or missing a reward event, that's a reasonable adjustment. Yeah, reasonable adjustments are what schools use to make adjustments for young people who have trauma experiences, who may have diagnosed disability, and all of our young people who are displaying any of these behaviours of concerns would be having reasonable adjustments made. Yeah, as I said, included in your education support plans, and be proactive in advocating for this. So you might have something like, this problem-solving approach, collaborative problem-solving, is going to be used with Tim, including, his mentor will be present, and it's going to be used following an escalated event. Yeah, and that's explicitly stated in the plan. And as I said, that the education policies in states and territories are all going to support this as a reasonable adjustment, as does the disability standards for education. So you're not asking for anything that sits outside of education's own policies and procedures when you're asking for this. If we jump to talking now with the young people, obviously when we're talking about doing problem solving with young people, we're going to have some really in-depth conversations. And I just think when we're talking about school with young people, there's three kind of things to keep in mind. One, we want to validate the positives that are happening for a young person because we want to really value, the young person more than just the issues they're having. Yeah, if we only ever talk about the issues, there's so much more to the young person, and it's a really great way about, building relationship and having, really communicating to the person you are more than the issues that you are having, right? So just those conversations about what do you enjoy, what are you good at. It also it lays the foundation for that strength building. The other thing that's really important to talk about is to find out about their peer relationships. Yeah, a lot of the issues that young people are having at school, or reasons for school refusal or school reluctance, can be related to peer relationships, and I think sometimes that can be a little bit overlooked. So, who are they hanging out with? Where and when, are they having any issues at school, etc., etc. I just had an education consultant yesterday talk to me about, when they talk to a young person who has had a history of school refusal, but what they're actually having problems with at the moment is a peer relationship with someone who used to be a friend. Yeah, so having that conversation really helped the young person get back to school. And then when we really start digging into school, and we really need to have these conversations in some depth, yeah? So what's the best bit about school? Again, trying to find that strength-based positive approach, and what's not good about school? Yeah, what's not working well? Now, remember, this can be really hard questions to answer, yeah? So it can take a fair bit of support for a young person to be having those conversations. It might need to be some ongoing conversations over periods of time. You might need to frame it in different ways with younger children, using things like, happy and smiley faces, happy and sad faces, but, different parts of the day to articulate how they're feeling about different parts of the school. If you could change one thing about school, what would it be? So having these conversations and being a bit creative about how you have that, just to kind of establish, I guess, the baseline of where things are at. Just got up here just some examples of what I kind of call early problem solving strategies. Yeah. So the first one is the child profile. You'll all have seen it 100 times because I show it all the time, but I really think that every single one of our young people should have a profile. It's a way of having a conversation with a young person that really helps identify What are their strengths? What do they enjoy? What do they find challenging? What are the signs that they're overwhelmed? And how can they be helped at school? Yeah. And if you are having this conversation with the young person and then taking that to the school to negotiate with the school and the teachers, that's a problem solving activity in a really proactive way. And if you can get everyone on board with this, hopefully it can circumvent some of the issues that might arise. Working agreements, we've got a whole section on working agreements in our resources. We really like working agreements. Again, it's a way of negotiating with a child around some key words. We use respect, safety, belonging and participation or have a go. They don't have to be those words, but they can relate to what the school is using in their positive behaviour plans. But essentially, it's something that you develop with the young person. So, for example, in here we've got respect, use good words. Perhaps this is a young person has a problem with, swearing when they get frustrated. So, if when you've got a working agreement like this developed with the young person, instead of the teacher saying, stop swearing or, you're not supposed to swear or something like that. They just have to point to the working agreement and go, oh, remember we talked about using good words, and if it's not working, then there's then it's just we're going to have a conversation about our working agreement, at the end of the lesson. Yeah. So it takes away, some of the heightened emotion around it. It also becomes a very predictable response for the young person. If you're using this kind of strategy, they know that if something happens, that the way it's going to be responded to is really consistent. That the response will always be calm and that there'll be an opportunity to negotiate what happens next. Yeah. That takes a lot of the heat out of the situation and really helps a young person, feel safe in doing that negotiation. So there's some kind of early models of problem solving. This next model is a model that we really like a lot. It's Ross Green's Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. What's fantastic about Ross Green is that he shares all of his resources. It's incredibly generous. If you go onto his website, everything that I talk about is in there. All of the sheets and the resources are there, and they're in more detail than obviously what I can talk about in this session today. But if you are interested in looking at this for any of your young people, again, reach out to your ed consultant, reach out to me. More than happy to work through it specifically around a young person. But this is a really great thing to use when there's been an incident, particularly, a more significant incident, or if the behaviours of concern are really frequent or significant and they're really interfering with school learning or getting along in the group. They're also a really great alternative if the school is using responses like suspension or timeout or missing or reward events to try and manage the behaviour. So one of the, and this is I think one of the key kind of aspects of this method when for LWB workers and carers, because what this first step does is really about trying to change the perception. Yeah, so we really want to shift the focus from this is something that the young person is, deliberately doing, to looking at the behaviour through the lens of what's the underlying message and what's the social emotional skill. So even if this is as far as you get in using this process with a school or, in a residential home or even at home, it'll help kind of shift the potential perception, of the behaviour. So I might just spend 3 minutes just doing it with you, which means I'm going to kind of look away from you and look at my other screen, which will be a bit strange. But what I want you to do is to think of a young person who's not managing that well at school at the moment. They're having some issues. What I'm going to do is just read out some skills, And if you think this is a skill that it's difficult for the child to access at times, and that seems to be making it difficult for the child to handle some of the problems and frustrations or to meet a certain expectation, I just want you to put a mark, on a piece of paper, So this section is really aimed at helping us think about the skills and the degree to which they might be impacting, on a child. So I'm just going to read them out. Don't think too hard about it. So just think about these skills. Okay. Maintaining focus, regulating activity level, handling transitions that are shifting from one mindset to another, considering the likely outcomes or consequences of actions, persist on challenging or tedious tasks, having that sense of time, that time has passed or the time that's needed for a task, considering a range of solutions to a problem, flexibly handling ambiguity or uncertainty, shifting from an original idea or a plan or a solution, expressing concerns, needs or thoughts in words or other means of communication, understanding what is being communicated by others, appreciating how their actions can affect others, regulating an emotional response to problems and frustrations, empathising with others, appreciating another person's perspective or point of view, interoception, that is the ability to understand and feel what's going on inside their body, and tolerating and managing the sensory environment. So I won't get you to kind of call out because I don't even know how many of you are there in how many of those skills you checked off. But it's fairly likely that if you've got a young person who is experiencing or showing some real behaviours of concern at school, that you've ticked off a number, of those skills. And again, if we think about school being often a pressure point, you think about how all of those skills are really necessary, to do well, in school at all times, to be able to manage all those things, that we can see that if a young person hasn't yet developed the capacity for all of those skills in all situations at all times, how that can impact on their ability to to manage the concern in a way that is acceptable to the school, right? So what I like using that for is it's a way of helping people shift how they perceive the child and the behaviour. So instead of it being a deliberate misbehaviour, it's more around, well, it's a skill that a young person may not yet have developed to the capacity that you are expecting in that situation. So if we think about it from a skill perspective, punishing someone for not having a skill, is kind of a nuts thing to do, right? Like that's not going to help develop the skill. That's not going to solve the problem, Whereas going into a problem-solving activity with a young person will not only develop the skill, but it will be a much more real way of resolving, what's going on. As I said, all of those resources are sitting on those links there. So the next thing that we would do if we do go into this problem-solving activity with the young person is really to start naming the unsolved problems. So an unsolved problem is essentially it's a specific expectation that the child is having trouble meeting. This can be an expectation at home or it can be an expectation at school. So we want to think of some of the unsolved problems the child is experiencing. There's some prompts that you can do. Is there an activity the young person is having trouble finishing or getting started on? Are there classmates the child is having difficulty getting along with in specific conditions? Now, the real hint around naming an unsolved problem is that the more specific, the better. Often we frame unsolved problems really broadly, like, the young person doesn't like going to school. It's a very broad problem and that would be really hard to solve. It's really about trying to name really specific problems and working on that solution. Now, there'll be more than one unsolved problem, and that's okay, So you name them all, and then you might just pick a couple to work on at a specific time, I've basically said this before, when we generalise problems. So, for example, speaking from experience, I'm unfit. That's difficult for me to solve. If I narrow it down, I find it difficult to get up in time in the morning to exercise. That's a problem I can actually start to, work on. Or I used to go to the gym, but now I can't afford the membership. That's another specific problem, that we can work on. If we say to a young person, we notice you have trouble moving between classes, that's when you seem to get into trouble a lot, is in that transition time again. That can be a little bit more difficult to solve, but if we narrow it down, we noticed you had trouble moving from the playground to the maths lesson on Monday. What was going on there? We noticed you had difficulty when you're lining up every time you're outside the art class, waiting to go into class. What's going on there? That becomes a problem that we can talk about and start finding some solutions with. So the more specific, the better. Then we start working through the problem with the young person, so we just name the problem. We notice you're having difficulty getting up by 7:30 on a school day. What's going on? So we ask them, okay, so you're not getting to sleep, early enough. Is there anything else? Are you're worried about a friendship group, or is there anything else? I'm almost, I'm on TikTok or, Insta or something like that till late at night. So you start naming all of the things, Then you start working towards a solution. It's also good to put in what your concern is about it. I'm worried that we can't get you to school on time and that lands you in trouble. It's not a great start to the day for you. So that the young person's hearing also, from the adult perspective, why you're worried about it. You summarise the issue, you're having trouble getting up in time because you're fighting with one of your friends at school and that worries you and you can't get to sleep. And then you start working on the solutions, I guess the key hint there is to really listen and validate the child's ideas. Don't immediately pull them apart if the solutions they come up with don't seem workable. I think as adults we tend to do that a little bit. I know some of the conversations we had in our schools were a bit, sometimes we'd have to, just listen to the solutions that the young people were coming up with and then massage with the young people something into something that was workable. Then we're talking through all this and getting to agree on a solution. That's a bit of a summary. This is really essentially what we used to use in our schools. It's an adapted version of the collaborative problem solving. It just breaks it down, into steps. I think it would be a really great thing, to share with a school around, this is what we really want to work through with a young person before we start looking at anything like a timeout or a suspension or a, missing out on a reward event. It also outlines really proactively steps to go through with each person if you're going to do a restorative practice. So restorative practice is where, say for instance, you've had two young people who are having a beef with each other and causing some issues and you want to get them together to resolve a solution. Sometimes I think why that breaks down is that we bring them together too quickly before we've actually worked through this type of a process individually with each young person before we kind of bring them together to try and resolve that. So it's also just a really good framework for looking at in a restorative practice between young people. That's a resource that's also on our SharePoint page. These are some of the collaborative problem solving Ross Green resources and more of the resources which we can send out. So I just guess the summary for me is that the issues at school often occur really because the expectation's too high. There's not enough scaffolding or support, for that young person to really meet that expectation. We see them in education plans all the time, and we feel that young people sometimes are being set up for failure. It can also happen that there's not enough expectation and consistency, so the young person really doesn't know exactly what's expected of them, and that can be complicated too. We use problem solving because it really helps to understand what's happening from the child's perspective, and if we know that, that's going to lead to the right strategies. If we're using it well, it can prevent relapse, that is, it can avoid the behaviour happening in the first place. It's a much more appropriate response than punitive responses, which really don't work and only serve to further isolate the young person. It's a real skill building approach, and that includes building skills for repair, which is really a life skill. If a situation's gone awry and you can repair that, that's a really fantastic life skill. And as I've said before, it should be named. And I'm going to throw over now to. Sorry, I really talked at you pretty fast, but I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to throw over to questions and comments. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. I don't know if there's any questions and comments in the chat. I know that's a lot. There was a lot of information in a fairly short space of time. Just to reiterate, if there's a young person that you feel would really benefit from some support, if there are some issues going on at school that you think more of a problem-solving approach would be beneficial, really happy to catch up with you and talk through this, more specifically around that young person, and give some more support,
Oh, look, I'm just going to say, just to back up what you just said then, to reach out, because I've been reaching out to my education support person here in Moreton, because I've got 3 or 4 young people, various ages, disengaging, etc. And it is a relief for me to have people that will help out with the education system, because I don't know the language so much, I don't know the processes, and I cannot recommend highly enough for you to reach out to education support people. We don't get a lot of support with the department, as you know, and having this amazing resource is, we've got a young man on Bribie Island, and honestly, if we didn't pull the education people in, he'd be on full suspension, I gather, by now. So, please just reach out and pick their brains and let them run the programs. It's been a great help to me in my role.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll pay you later. That was
okay.
Great.
That's all right. And don't forget to pay Donna Mitchum as well.
I certainly will, shall we?
Michelle B has said that she is sitting in the room with 3 lovely social work students, and she's asking if you can explain why a punitive approach doesn't work with our children and young people in out-of-home care or who have complex histories.
Yeah. Thanks, V. Essentially, a punitive approach is really looking at the behaviour, but not looking at the underlying cause for the behaviour. So if you're just addressing the presenting behaviour, but not looking at what the cause of it is and not working on the solution to the cause, it'll happen again. And our young people who have these behaviours of concern have often experienced things like getting sent home early, getting suspended, and it can actually have some really serious consequences, like feelings like that they don't belong in education, that education's not for them, they don't deserve a place, in the school. Those feelings of rejection, can be really amplified by some of those responses. It can also end up being a preferred space to be, because if you're sitting in an environment where you don't feel that welcomed, where you do feel like you're kind of often in trouble, where you do feel like you're going to get shamed in front of your peers because you can't keep up with the work, or then lots of young people will prefer to be at home. So in fact, people will often say to me, they know the behaviours that get them sent home. They just know that they can, if they behave in this way, that gets them sent home, that gets them out of that environment. And if you look at it from our own adult perspective, if we're sitting in a really uncomfortable environment, like that, we might not choose to stay there either, right? So, just off the top of my head, there are a few of the reasons why that punishment response is really not an appropriate response, for a young person particularly a young person who has a trauma background or a young person who has a diagnosed disability. If we're not addressing, the underlying cause of the behaviour, we're not going to shift or change that behaviour, and we're going to create, additional problems. Yeah. Behaviour reflects needs. That's right, Fee. And it's all behaviour is a communication. So what's the behaviour telling us? Yeah, that's what we really need to be looking at.
I agree, totally.
Thanks, Megan. Any other questions in chat?
No, but I recommend the students read the Herbert Lovett. There's some articles that we use in care that was Herbert Lovett, but definitely look at the Herbert Lovett stuff. That's really helpful when they're looking at those, especially for students.
Thanks, Tracy. Maybe can you put a link in, Tracy, in the chat, maybe?
Thank you, Tracy.
When it comes to documenting the process for young people, in regards to life story processes.
A few questions about the resources. Absolutely, we'll share the resources. They'll all go up on our SharePoint page, Megan. Yeah. And I might just add to the PowerPoint just a little bit more explicitly where you can find each particular resource. But if you look at resources on our SharePoint page, everything that I've shown you is there. You can also go on to the what's Ross Green's website again, Megan? The Our Lives in the Balance.
Our Lives in the Balance.
Our Lives in the Balance website. But again, that'll be on the PowerPoint as well, and you'll find all those amazing resources. No more questions or comments? Again, just again encouragement. How do you work with school that doesn't support? Yeah, sorry, I lost that one. Maybe you can pick that up with Megan. But just, really support people to feel like you can advocate for a different response for a young person, and to do it proactively so that, at the start of the year, or if you're enrolling in a new school, to be really upfront. We might come across some behaviours of concern. These are some of the reasons why, that you might see them. We don't want to end up, in a suspension. We don't want to end up with these sorts of responses. So what can we put in place now, and can that be reflected in the education plan? Yeah, up front, as a different response. I know that Karen in Tassie has had written into education plans that that a young person cannot be suspended before there's been a stakeholder meeting, where everyone comes together to talk about, what's happening and what's going on and what other responses, can be possible. So if we know that our young people are, likely to present with escalated behaviours at school, let's be really upfront about that with the school, but plan for it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Megan, did another question come through that I just saw quickly or not?
It did. So there's a couple in there around documentation. So like how tips for documenting for a process, the process for young people. So how are we actually just showing that through so that they have a documentation about their life story? And then there is one around how do you work with school that doesn't support the young people?
Okay. Well, that's a very broad question. And I know that, there are some schools that seem to put in a lot of barriers, for our young people. It takes a lot of work. The first point I would make with, complex schools is to try and build the relationship with the school. I know that's really hard, but and to keep patience and a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's much
Yeah.
more practical fee. But
Mhm.
yes, I mean, it's absolutely, it is hanging in there. It is trying to find a way to build the relationship. It is that whole thing of, it takes a village, trying to solve this on our own. If school tries to solve it on their own, it's not going to work. If home tries to solve it on their own, it's not going to work. It's only by all of us coming together that we're going to actually try and find solutions. Most schools, they're in the business of educating, kids. Most schools would want to do, the right thing by kids. If they're not doing the right thing by kids, it's often because they're overwhelmed or they don't know what the next step is. So trying to reach out and find that mutual kind of happy ground and build that relationship. If that doesn't work, there are certainly, you can always go up, you can go to regional offices to find more support. There are always avenues, for looking for further support and for advocating. So again, if you're really struggling, reach out, and I'm happy to answer that question more specifically with the person who's asked that question. And how do we share with the young person? I think I think there's lots of different ways that, that we're getting better, at doing that with young people. But I think, again, just involving the young person in the problem solving activity and just documenting, what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Again, if you have a look on Ross Green's website, there's lots of forms and pages that you can kind of fill out with that. But by doing it with the young person, you're going to have the young person's voice in there. Yeah, like you really want to make sure that when you framed the problem, you're using the words that the young person's using. It's the same with working agreements. You're using the words that the young person's using. Yeah, you're not putting your own adult kind of lens on it. Yeah, and I think that's one of the best ways to really share that with young people. Make sure that it feels like it's still owned by the young person. You doing, Megan?
Good. Everyone's slowed up in the chat. Anyone?
No.
There we go. What policy or law can I refer to when schools exclude young people from excursions and other fun activities due to previous suspensions and that have no direct link with the behaviour, noting that young people, that the young person has a disability. Normally the suspension occurs at the start of a term, and of course the excursions happen at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, your disability standards for education would be the first one that I would refer to, and it's not legal to discriminate against a child in that way. Excursions and access to excursions have to accommodate the varying needs of the young person. So if they're saying they can't come to the excursion because, they're not safe crossing a road, well, then they have to develop some strategies so that the young person can safely cross the road, or that maybe there's no roads involved. That's the law. Yeah. So particularly if a young person, has a diagnosed disability, it's really clear cut. So the disability standards is the first place I'd go to. Each state and territory will also have policies and procedures around equity and access. Yeah. So yes, there are definitely policies. We do have on our website, we've got some policy presentations that outline some of those for the states and territories. You can also just Google search in your state and territory, and again, you can reach out to us and we can try and help you find the ones that specifically pinpoint. But I'd start with the disability standards. And if you say to a school, we think that you excluding a young person from an excursion contravenes the Disability Standards for Education, 2005 Act, it'll probably make them sit up and take notice. Yeah.
Can I just say that it doesn't? I'm sorry. It doesn't make them stand up and take notice, because what they have then said to me, exactly the same, this young person, was they didn't have the staff to fund the they didn't have the funding to fund staff for the excursion. We offered to get a youth worker to take this young person down to the excursion. We offered for him to go into the youth worker's car and we meet down there. We were really proactive with our solutions so this young person could get to the excursion. This was in December last year, and they kept saying, no, 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 no funding for a support person with him. It was just, it appeared too hard. You know, then they were starting to throw, well, what about insurance? Who's going to be, and like we were all prepared to do that, but every step of the way they blocked this young person going on this excursion. And no matter how hard we went in, it ended up, oh, well, we haven't got the staff. And then things about, you know, like safe, you know, risk assessments and all of that sort of thing. So it is happening. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
And
No, look, I
they
don't-
will
yeah,
just,
yeah.
they just identified this young person and, you know, sure, he ran away. Yep, sure. But, you know, we had youth workers, everybody ready to go, and he just wasn't able to attend.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
So
that comes across as punitive, as we were just discussing. He even said, I can't go on this excursion because I've been bad, you know? So yeah, it is happening.
thanks for telling us that story, Jennifer. And yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to say that it's going to fix all problems. It's certainly
yeah,
the start point. It's certainly the start point. And for some schools, it will make a difference, right? But yes,
Yep.
there are some schools that will absolutely dig in and they will
Yep.
talk about all the things that Jennifer's talked about, you know, lack of funding, you know, safety risks, all those sorts of things. And it can be a really hard battle. You know, I mean, it makes my blood boil because
absolutely.
they are contravening, you know,
And,
the
yep,
law in doing that.
absolutely. Yep.
So in Queensland, Leanne's just put in there, get your principal education officer from Queensland involved because
Yep.
it's their role to advocate, you know, for the young person. You can make a complaint, yeah, about the school. I would make a complaint, you know. You know, as a parent, I would raise a ministerial about that because it really is direct discrimination, and schools should be held to account for that. Again, if we can help in any way, reach out. Yes, Jennifer, you're absolutely right. You can do all of those things, and schools can still, you know, contravene, you know, all of those things. But you know, let's keep trying, yeah, because it is, yeah, it's really devastating to hear, yeah, about
And
those
it
sorts of
just to me,
responses from schools because
yeah.
it isolates the young person.
Oh,
They feel
yep.
very excluded, yeah. Yeah.
It also goes a bit back to this punitive stuff, whereas, you know, the kids sit down and behave yourself, don't walk around. So what happens then is that fosters this belief in amongst his peers that they are bad people. They go home and go, oh, look, he's the naughty, or they're the naughty children in the class. And, you know, so right back from the go, they're behind the eighth ball because their peers are going, oh, there's a naughty boy, he's a naughty person, you know, with the punitive stuff. And so, yeah, somehow if we can get the educators to, you know, like use gentle language, especially when the peers are so impressionable that, you know, these little people aren't going to be labelled as the bad child of the class, you know, all that sort of stuff that, you know, we're still seeing today.
Yeah. And they're very valid concerns to bring up, you know, with schools, because you're absolutely right. It's the modelling of the adults as to how kids are very good at accepting different conditions for different kids as long as it's modelled well, you know. So kids will be very accepting that, you know, one young person needs headphones on, one young person, you know, needs more breaks, one young, you know, kids are very good at accepting it. If it's modelled by the adults in a very calm and accepting way. So that's also something, you know, that we can absolutely advocate for with schools too. Yeah.
And I think the consistency is extremely important in that as well, that all the teachers do it, you know, so the teacher in the playground doesn't go, you go to the principal, or the PE teacher doesn't say, right, you're sitting out for that. And then, you know, I think if they're consistent, but, you know, we'll get there. I'm very sure we will get there.
Yeah. That's where that profile document can be useful, and a request that every, teacher that interacts with the young person has at least read and seen the profile. Yeah, which, so that's one strategy there. Yeah. Okay. Hey, thanks everyone for hanging in. I'm just
that
conscious
was
of
really good.
time.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks everyone for contributing, and good luck out there. And please, as always, reach out. Thanks everybody.